He just wanted to spend an ordinary day fishing. But when he pulled an old rusty safe from the bottom, everything changed. What he saw inside made his face turn pale. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to comment where you're watching from. The first light of morning came softly over Glenmore Lake, a pale gray shimmer spreading through the mist that still clung to the surface like breath on cold glass. The water was quiet, unbroken except for the faint ripple of a small wooden boat moving slowly toward the center. Inside it sat Marcus Jenkins, his broad shoulders hunched against the chill, hands steady on the worn oars. He had been out here more mornings than he could count, enough that the creak of wood and the lapping of water against the hull had become the rhythm of his life. To most people in town, fishing at dawn was an odd habit. To Marcus, it was survival, though not just for food or money. The lake was the only place left where the world didn't press in too close. The air smelled of mud and moss, and each breath filled his lungs with that damp, earthy scent that belonged only to places where time moved slowly. Far off, the outlines of the pines were blurred by fog, their reflections trembling in the stillness. Marcus always liked this hour before anyone else was awake, when the lake belonged only to him and to the memories that drifted across its surface like ghosts. He set down his net and leaned forward, peering into the dull green water. His father had fished here too, and before him his grandfather, both men now gone, both buried in the small churchyard beyond the ridge. The Jenkins family had always lived close to the lake. They knew its moods, its tempers, and its silences. His grandfather used to say the lake was alive, that it had moods just like a person. You treat it with respect, he told Marcus once, and it'll feed you. But if you start poking where you shouldn't, it'll swallow you whole. As a child, Marcus thought those were just stories told to keep him from rowing too far out. But as he grew older, he realized there were truths buried in the old man's words, truths that didn't need explaining. The people in town said the lake was cursed. They said that back in the 1970s a banker named Walter Harlan and his family disappeared somewhere out there. Harlan had owned a big house near the shore, white with green shutters, long since sold off and left to rot. Rumor had it that he'd stolen money from his own bank and tried to escape across the lake one stormy night. The boat was found a few days later, overturned and empty. Some said his wife's body had washed up near the rocks. Others swore they saw lights under the water that same week. Marcus had grown up hearing those tales whispered at the diner, where old men stirred their coffee and shook their heads like the story was both tragedy and warning. He never believed in curses, but he knew one thing for sure. The lake held on to what it wanted. This morning was like any other, or so it began. The fog drifted low, thick enough that the world beyond 20 feet seemed to dissolve into nothingness. Marcus cast his line, watching the ripples spread and fade. Hours could pass this way. He wasn't in a hurry. The rhythm of waiting was part of the work, part of what kept his thoughts from wandering to the bills on the kitchen table, to the cracked walls of his little house, to the quiet ache of loneliness that came at night when the radio went silent. He shifted his weight, checked his reel, and then felt it. A sudden tension, sharp and solid at the end of the line. Not a fish. Not the usual tug or struggle. Something heavier. Something that didn't move at all. He frowned and gave a slow pull. The line held fast, vibrating faintly as though it had hooked onto stone. Probably a log or a chunk of metal. The lake was full of that kind of debris, relics from the old dock that had collapsed years ago. Still, there was something strange in the weight of it. It didn't feel dead, it felt anchored as if it belonged there and didn't want to be disturbed. Marcus braced his feet and pulled harder. The boat tilted slightly. The reel groaned in protest. The water began to cloud as he hauled up the line, a dark swirl rising from the depths. He wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. Then, with a dull scrape, the line shifted, giving just enough slack for him to glimpse something through the murk, an edge of rusted metal, square and solid. His heartbeat quickened. This was no branch. He gripped the line, wrapping it around his wrist, and pulled with both arms until the object came free from the mud below. As it surfaced, it hit the side of the boat with a hollow clang that echoed over the still water. The sound startled a flock of birds from the reeds. They rose in a sudden flurry of wings, their cries cutting through the silence. Marcus steadied the boat and leaned over. The object bobbed beside him, coated in algae and silt. It was a box. No, a safe. Small enough to fit in the boat, heavy enough to threaten its balance. The sight of it sent a cold tingle up his spine. The lake wasn't supposed to give up things like this. He stared at the safe, heart pounding. Decades of rust had eaten through parts of it, but the door was still sealed, the dial frozen in place. He could see the faint outline of letters etched into the metal, though the years had blurred them. His first thought was to drop it back. Whatever it wasn't his. The second thought came slower and stayed longer. What if there was money inside? People threw strange things away when they were scared. If the stories about the banker were true, maybe this was what he had tried to hide. Marcus sat very still, the mist curling around him like breath. He told himself not to be stupid, but curiosity had already taken hold. He grabbed the rope he used to anchor the boat and looped it through the handle of the safe, tying it tight. It took all his strength to hoist it onto the floor of the boat. The weight made the hull sink lower in the water, the edges lapping dangerously close to spilling over. For a moment, he thought he'd have to let it go. Then the boat steadied, rocking gently again. He pushed a hand across the safe's surface, feeling the roughness of rust beneath his fingers. It was cold, colder than the air, like it had trapped the chill of the deep. The thought unsettled him. He didn't like the idea of touching something that had been down there for so long, sealed away from light and breath. The fog was thickening again, swallowing the opposite shore. He decided to head back before it closed in completely. As he rowed, his mind wouldn't stop circling the same questions. What if this thing belonged to someone dangerous? What if whoever had thrown it in still lived around here? But no, 50 years had passed since the Harlan story. Everyone from that time was either dead or too old to care. And even if there was something illegal in it, it wasn't like the sheriff would bother with a fisherman's find. The sheriff had never bothered with Marcus before. Why would he start now? By the time he reached the shore, the sun had burned through a little of the fog, spreading thin light over the shallows. He dragged the safe out of the boat, each scrape against the wood sounding louder than it should. The ground squelched beneath his boots as he pulled it up the small slope toward his shed. His house stood a little way off, half hidden behind willows, its paint peeling, the porch sagging under years of neglect. He paused for a moment to catch his breath, glancing around the empty stretch of lakefront. No one. Only a few crows watching from the fence post. Marcus slipped the safe inside his shed and pulled a tarp over it. His hands were shaking slightly, though he couldn't say why. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a sense that he had crossed an invisible line. That object had been meant to stay in the dark, buried under the weight of water and silence. Pulling it out felt like breaking some old agreement between man and lake. He locked the shed and went to wash up, but the smell of rust stayed on his palms no matter how hard he scrubbed. That evening, the rain began. Thin at first, then heavier, tapping against the roof like impatient fingers. Marcus sat on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching the lights of the distant town flicker across the water. His mind returned again and again to the safe. It wasn't the first strange thing the lake had given him. Once he'd pulled up a rusted bicycle, another time a broken revolver, but this was different. The safe had weight, not just in metal, but in meaning. It looked like something that had been hidden for a reason. He thought of calling someone. The police, maybe? But what would he say? I fished a safe out of the lake, and it looks suspicious. They'd laugh, or worse, they'd come and take it away, and he'd never know what was inside. He had lived his whole life being told what he could or couldn't do, what he could or couldn't have. For once, he wanted to decide for himself. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of the rain through the open door. Somewhere out there, in the dark, the lake sighed, a long, low ripple that brushed against the shore and was gone. Marcus turned his head toward it. He could swear he heard something else beneath that sound, something faint and hollow like metal moving underwater. He told himself it was just the wind, but his stomach knotted all the same. When he went to bed, the rain had turned to a steady downpour. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that rusted box sinking again, felt the drag of it through the water, the unseen things it might have passed on its way down. He imagined the banker's face, pale and bloated, watching from the depths. Sometime past midnight he rose, went to the window, and looked out. The rain had thinned to drizzle. The lake lay hidden under mist again, as if nothing had happened that morning. Only the faint reflection of the moon broke its surface. He stared at it for a long while, his reflection a dark shape against the glass. Behind him, the shed was just a shadow among shadows, but he could almost feel the weight of what sat inside it, waiting. When he finally lay back down, one thought followed him into sleep, quiet but relentless. The lake had given something up, and whatever it had given, it would want back. The storm passed before dawn. When Marcus woke, the world outside was washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and pine. The lake shimmered under a new light, calm and ordinary again. But he couldn't shake the sense that the stillness was only pretending, that beneath the surface the lake was watching, waiting for him to make his next move. He stepped outside, stretched, and glanced toward the shed. For a moment, he could almost believe he saw a thin wisp of steam rising from under the door, though he knew it was just the morning fog rolling in. The sun touched the water with a silver gleam, and the whole lake seemed to hold its breath. Marcus felt something inside him tighten, a mix of dread and curiosity. He knew that what he'd done couldn't be undone. The story that had begun at dawn was far from over, and somewhere deep beneath that calm surface, Glenmore Lake was keeping count. By the time the gray morning stretched across Glenmore Lake, Marcus had already been awake for hours. He sat at his small kitchen table, sipping coffee that had gone cold long before he remembered to drink it. Outside, the mist still hung low over the water, a pale veil drifting through the trees. From where he sat, he could just see the outline of his shed, and though the door was shut tight, he felt the weight of what was inside pressing against his thoughts. The safe sat there, mute and immovable, like a secret waiting for him to make the first move. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The way it had come up from the lake, the heaviness of it, the faint glint of letters beneath the rust. Everything about it felt wrong, like a thing that had not wanted to return to daylight. He had dreamed about it through the night, about pulling it up again and again, each time seeing different hands on the rope, his grandfather's, his father's, strangers. Sometimes the safe opened by itself in his dreams, and the inside was full of dark water. Marcus rose, rubbing at the stubble on his jaw. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and coffee grounds. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside. The world was hushed. The rain had passed, but the air was still heavy, the soil soft underfoot. When he opened the shed, the smell of rust and algae wafted out at once, sharp and metallic. The safe looked smaller than he remembered, but denser somehow, like it was holding its breath. He crouched beside it and brushed away the film of dried mud that had cracked overnight. He ran his fingertips along the faint engraving on the side. Most of the words were unreadable, but one part was clear enough to make his stomach tighten. First Southern Bank. He remembered hearing that name before, and the stories about the Harlan family. That was the bank the old man had owned before he disappeared. Marcus stood up and stared down at the safe, the morning light slipping through the slats of the shed and striking the corroded surface like pale fire. A thought came to him, small and insistent. What if this is the one? He went to his workbench and searched through a drawer until he found a can of oil and a wrench. His plan was simple enough: see if the bolts would turn, if the handle would move. But as he crouched down to start, a sound outside made him freeze. The crunch of gravel on the narrow road by his house. He waited, heart thudding, but the noise faded after a few seconds. Probably just a passing truck. Still, he felt the hairs on his arms rise. He spent the next hour trying to work the lock. The dial wouldn't budge. The hinge wouldn't move. The metal was too corroded to give, even with oil. He hit it once with the wrench, but the blow only echoed through the shed like a hollow bell. Frustration welled up in him, followed quickly by doubt. Maybe it wasn't worth it. Maybe it was just empty, filled with mud and nothing more. But curiosity, once it had taken root, was a hard thing to kill. When the afternoon came, Marcus drove into town. He told himself it was just to pick up supplies: WD-40, a crowbar, maybe some sandpaper. But he also wanted to hear if anyone had noticed what he'd pulled out of the lake. The road wound along the edge of the water, past the abandoned boat dock and the line of cypress trees that marked the halfway point to town. As he drove, he noticed tire tracks on the shoulder that weren't his. They were fresh, maybe from the night before. The town of Glenmore was small, 2 streets crossing each other, a diner, a gas station, a hardware store, and not much else. When Marcus pushed open the door of the hardware store, the bell above it jingled. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust and oil. Mrs. Carter, the owner, looked up from the counter and smiled faintly. "Mornin', Marcus," she said. "You were out early yesterday, weren't you? Old Pete said he saw your boat way out by the north side." Marcus's grip tightened around the handle of his basket. "Yeah," he said lightly. "Good fishing weather." "Mm-hmm." She scanned a box of nails. "He said he saw you pulling something big up. What'd you catch, a sunken car?" He forced a chuckle. "Just a tangle of wire. Nearly lost my net." Mrs. Carter laughed and shook her head. "You and that lake. One day, it's gonna swallow you whole." He smiled back, paid for his things, and left. But as he walked to his truck, he noticed a man leaning against a lamp post on the other side of the street. The man wore a dark cap and a tan jacket, and though he pretended to be checking his phone, Marcus could feel his eyes following him. He started the engine and pulled out of town without looking back. On the drive home, He turned on the radio to drown out his thoughts. The station was playing one of those local segments, History Hour with Frank and Denise, the kind where old-timers called in to reminisce about the town's past. Normally, he would have changed the channel, but then he heard a name that froze his hand on the dial. "And that brings us to the Harlan mystery," the host was saying. 52 years this summer since banker Walter Harlan vanished along with his wife and son. Folks still talk about it every now and then. Some say he stole from his own bank, others that he was framed. Either way, that lake's been keeping its secrets. Marcus felt a chill crawl up his neck. He listened as the show went on, the host reading old clippings, callers giving their theories. One man claimed his father had helped search the shoreline back in '72 and found blood on the rocks. Another said divers had once spotted something metallic deep under the surface, but couldn't retrieve it because of silt. Marcus turned off the radio before they finished. His hands were trembling slightly on the steering wheel. When he got home, he parked by the shed and sat in the truck for a long time, staring at the wooden walls as though he could see through them. He thought of the man in the cap, of the tire tracks on the road, of Mrs. Carter's casual curiosity. It wouldn't take much for word to spread. One person said something, another repeated it, and soon everyone would know that Marcus Jenkins had pulled something strange from the lake. In a town like Glenmore, gossip traveled faster than fire. He got out and went inside. The shed was dim, the smell of oil hanging heavy in the air. He took the new tools from his bag and laid them out neatly beside the safe. He studied the door again. The lock was old-fashioned, a circular dial with deep grooves, the kind they used in banks half a century ago. The handle was solid steel, pitted and brown. He sprayed the oil into the seams and waited, listening to it hiss as it sank into the rust. The hours passed. Outside, the sky shifted from pale blue to the dull gold of evening. He could hear the wind moving through the reeds, the gentle slap of water against the dock. He struck the safe once, twice, then again, each blow ringing through the shed like a heartbeat. Finally, exhausted, he sat back on his heels. The metal hadn't given. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead. His hands were black with rust. He glanced toward the window and froze. A car was parked across the road, half hidden behind the trees. He could just make out the shape of it. A dark SUV, engine off, windows tinted. He watched it for several minutes. No one got out. After a while, it rolled forward and disappeared down the road. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just seeing things, but deep down, he knew better. Someone else was interested in that lake. Maybe they'd been interested for a long time. Night came quick, wrapping the shoreline in shadow. Marcus locked the shed and went inside, double-checking the doors and windows before sitting down to eat. He wasn't hungry. The safe had stirred something restless in him, a sense that the past was leaning too close. He poured himself a drink and stared at the flickering light from the small lamp on his table. He remembered his grandfather's voice again, how he used to talk about the lake as if it had a mind of its own. And don't forget, boy, it just waits. Marcus had always thought that was superstition, the kind of thing old men said when they'd spent too many years alone, but tonight, with the safe just a few yards away, those words felt truer than ever. The clock ticked past 10. He went to the window and looked out. The shed was a dark shape under the moonlight. The air was still. Then, faintly, he saw movement, a figure standing by the water line. It was too far to make out clearly, just a silhouette against the pale shimmer of the lake. He blinked, and the shape was gone. Marcus stood there for a long time, listening. The only sound was the whisper of reeds brushing against each other. He told himself it was just shadows, tricks of the moonlight. But the feeling of being watched lingered long after he'd gone to bed. He dreamed again of the safe. In his dream, he opened it easily, and inside was a mirror instead of money or papers. When he looked into it, the reflection wasn't his. It was a man in a suit, his face waterlogged, his eyes open and staring. Marcus woke in the dark, breathless, the sound of rain beginning again outside. At dawn, he rose and went to the shed. The air was cold, his breath a pale mist. The safe sat exactly where he'd left it. Yet something felt different, as though the shed itself had shifted in the night. He knelt beside the safe and pressed his palm against the metal. It was warm. Not from the air, not from the sun, just faintly warm from within, as though it had been holding on to something alive. He drew his hand back slowly. Somewhere in the trees, a bird called out, then went silent. Marcus turned toward the lake, watching as the light crept over the water. The surface was calm, too calm. It didn't feel like morning anymore. It felt like the pause before something starts. He stood there until the fog began to lift, and for the first time since finding the safe, a small thought formed in his mind, one that made his chest tighten with a mix of fear and resolve. He would open it, no matter what it took. The lake had buried its truth for half a century, but now that it had chosen to give it up, Marcus knew he had no choice but to see it through. What he didn't see, as he turned back toward the house, was the car that rolled quietly down the opposite road, its dark windows glinting once in the light before disappearing behind the trees. Morning came heavy with mist again, the kind that clung to the trees and swallowed sound. Marcus had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the safe, its dull metal skin shining wet under the weak bulb of his shed. It wasn't just an object anymore. It felt like a presence, like a living thing that had followed him out of the lake and now sat waiting for him to make a mistake. He'd thought about smashing it open in the middle of the night, but something about that idea felt wrong, almost dangerous. He wasn't sure if the danger came from the safe itself or from whatever world it was tied to, but he couldn't shake the feeling that once it opened, nothing in his life would go back to how it was. When the clock finally touched 7, he gave up on pretending to sleep. He made coffee, watched the steam curl against the window, and tried not to think about how quiet everything was. Even the birds seemed to keep away from the lake that morning. A layer of fog drifted above the water like breath frozen in the air, and the reflection of the rising sun was weak and colorless. Marcus dressed quickly and decided to head into town again. He told himself it was just for groceries and fuel, but deep down he wanted to see if anyone had said anything new. The air around him felt tense, expectant, as if the whole town had caught wind of something and was just waiting for him to confirm it. He locked his door out of habit, though he doubted a lock would keep out whatever had started circling him since he pulled that safe out of the water. The drive into Glenmore was short but uneventful. The same dirt road, the same crooked power poles, the same sagging fence that marked the halfway point. But near the bend by the old cypress grove, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Fresh tracks again. They weren't from his truck. They were wider, deeper, like something heavier had rolled through while he slept. He slowed down, but didn't stop. Whoever had been out here last night had come close, maybe even up to his driveway. When he reached town, the streets were still half asleep. The smell of bacon drifted from the diner. The gas station pump rattled in the wind. At the far end, the sheriff's cruiser sat outside the post office, empty. Marcus parked in front of the small store and stepped out, nodding to a couple of old men sitting on the bench by the door. They were already talking about the weather, about the crops, and, he quickly realized, about him. "Mornin', Jenkins," one of them said, squinting up at him. "Heard you pulled something out of the lake yesterday. Big old box, wasn't it?" Marcus forced a smile. "Just an old hunk of junk, probably part of that dock that broke off." The man chuckled. "Sure looked heavier than a dock plank. Folks talkin' you found a treasure chest." Marcus laughed it off, but his hands stayed tight in his pockets. "If it was, it's full of mud. You all know that lake. It keeps everything that falls in." The men grinned, but he could see curiosity simmering behind their eyes. He nodded politely and stepped inside before they could ask more. The store was warm and smelled of coffee grounds and newsprint. He bought what he needed, paid quickly, and left without meeting anyone's gaze. The air outside felt thicker than before, like eyes were on him even when he wasn't being watched. As he drove home, the radio droned softly in the background. The morning talk segment was replaying last night's episode, the one about the missing banker, Walter Harlan. Marcus hadn't meant to listen, but he couldn't bring himself to change the station. The announcer's voice was calm, casual, like someone telling ghost stories to children. "And though the case went cold," the man said, "many believe the banker tried to hide stolen funds in or around Glenmore Lake before vanishing. Divers found nothing but debris and silt. Some say the safe went down with him, and others say he made it to shore and buried it somewhere in the woods." Marcus's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. He turned the radio off, but the words stuck. The safe wasn't just an object anymore. It was a piece of that story, and if anyone found out he had it, he wouldn't be just a fisherman anymore. He'd be a man with something people wanted, something they might kill for. When he got home, the silence felt heavier than usual. The lake was still, its surface smooth as glass. He stood by the water for a moment, looking out over it, and thought about the banker's last night alive. A man rowing into the dark with a secret he couldn't keep, maybe hearing thunder rolling behind him, maybe already knowing he wouldn't make it back. Marcus shivered, though the sun was climbing higher now. He went to the shed and unlocked the door. The safe hadn't moved, of course. It just sat there in the gloom, but the smell inside the shed seemed sharper, more metallic. He crouched down beside it and wiped off another patch of rust. Beneath the grime, the lettering was clearer now. First Southern Bank, Branch 12, and beneath that, faintly scratched by hand, were 2 digits, 72. The year of Harlan's disappearance. Marcus sat back on his heels. The shed was silent except for the faint hum of a fly near the window. He ran his thumb along the number until the edge of the rust flaked off. This was no coincidence. He knew that now. Every piece of him wanted to pretend it was still just an old safe, but the truth pressed harder the longer he looked at it. He thought of his grandfather again, the stories he used to tell about how the police had come in 72 and ordered everyone off the lakeshore for days. They'd set up tents, spotlights, even brought in divers from the city, but they found nothing. When the search ended, the men in suits told everyone to keep quiet for the good of the town. His grandfather had always spat when he said that. For the good of who, you mean? Marcus had never paid much attention back then, but now those words echoed like warnings. The same families still ran the town. The same names were on the buildings. Maybe some of those men in suits were still around, or their sons were. He leaned closer to the safe. "What the hell did you see down there?" he muttered. The sound of gravel shifting outside made him start. He stood quickly, listening. Nothing. Just the wind again. Still, he locked the shed behind him when he left, pocketing the key. The afternoon dragged on in uneasy silence. He tried to busy himself with repairs, tightening a loose plank on the porch, cleaning his nets, but his mind kept circling back to the same thought. Someone knew. Someone had followed him that day on the lake or seen him hauling the safe up the slope. The dark SUV on the road, the man in the cap. It couldn't all be coincidence. As the sun began to drop behind the hills, the world turned gold for a moment before slipping into the deep blue of twilight. Marcus stood by the water again, watching ripples crawl across the surface. He caught a faint glimmer out by the reeds, something metallic reflecting light before vanishing beneath the surface. He squinted, but it was gone. Maybe it was a fish. Maybe not. He turned toward the house and froze. Someone had left footprints on the wet soil near the shed, large, heavier than his. He crouched to look closer. The prints led up to the door and back again, vanishing into the trees. He hadn't heard a car. Whoever it was must have come on foot. Marcus's pulse thudded in his ears. He went inside, closed the door, and pulled the curtain shut. He thought about calling the sheriff, but what would he say? That someone had been nosing round his property. The sheriff barely liked him, and half the town still saw him as an outsider, even though he'd been born there. No, the sheriff wouldn't help. The safest thing was to stay quiet and keep the safe hidden. That night, the dreams came again. He was rowing out into the lake, the fog so thick he could barely see his hands. The water beneath him wasn't water anymore, but a dark mirror, reflecting faces that weren't his own. He could hear whispers rising from below, words that blurred into the sound of oars hitting the surface. When he reached the center, something brushed against the bottom of the boat. He looked down and saw the outline of the safe beneath the water, open this time, light pouring out of it like from a window into another world. Then a hand reached up from the light, pale and bloated, grabbing his wrist. He woke, gasping, the echo of water still in his ears. It took him a moment to remember where he was. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the moon through the window. Outside, the lake was invisible, hidden under a layer of mist. He lay still, listening, and then he heard it. The soft crunch of footsteps on gravel again. Not close, but near enough. He sat up, heart hammering. The steps moved once, twice, and then stopped. Silence. He stayed awake until dawn. When the light came, weak and thin, he went outside to check. There were prints again, faint but real, leading from the trees toward the lake and back. He followed them as far as the shore, but there they vanished into the damp earth. For a long time he stood there, watching the water shift. The surface was calm, but beneath it something darker stirred. He could feel it, though he couldn't see it. The lake was alive with memory, and now that he'd disturbed it, it would not rest until its secrets were settled again. He turned back toward the house, weary but certain of one thing. He couldn't stop now. The safe wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was part of something larger, something that had festered in this town for decades. And if the people who once buried it still had power here, then they would come for him soon enough. He looked out once more over Glenmore Lake, where the fog was already lifting into ribbons of silver light. The air carried the faint smell of iron and rain. The world looked peaceful, but Marcus knew better. The lake had whispered to him now, its voice faint but unmistakable, and what it had said was clear: some debts don't stay buried. By the next morning, the sky over Glenmore hung low and gray, thick with the promise of rain. The lake was almost invisible beneath the blanket of mist that clung to its surface. Marcus had not slept again. The night had passed in silence, broken only by the occasional groan of the wooden house as the wind shifted. He had sat by the window until dawn, a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, watching the faint ripples of fog twist over the water. Every creak outside made him look up. Every sound became a question. By sunrise, his nerves felt stretched thin as wire. He tried to tell himself he was imagining things, that the footprints, the car, the feeling of being watched were all just his mind playing tricks on him after too many restless nights. But deep down, he knew better. He had spent his life trusting the quiet instincts that came from years alone on the lake. Instincts that told him when a storm was coming or when fish were moving beneath the surface. That same instinct now told him danger was close. He stood by the shed door for a long time before opening it. The padlock was still there, but the latch was slightly bent, as if someone had tested its strength. He crouched to look closer. It wasn't much, just a faint distortion in the metal, but it was enough to make his stomach tighten. Someone had tried to get inside. The safe was still in its place, sitting in the corner beneath the weak light that filtered through the wooden slats. A patch of condensation had formed on the floor around it, a dark circle that looked almost like it was sweating. Marcus brushed his hand against the metal and drew back quickly. The surface was cold, colder than the air inside the shed. He felt a strange urge to cover it again, to hide it from sight as though it could see him too. He threw the tarp back over it and locked the door once more. He had barely turned toward the house when he heard the sound of an engine. It wasn't the deep rumble of a truck like his. It was smoother, newer, the kind of vehicle no one around Glenmore usually drove. He froze, eyes narrowing toward the dirt road. A black sedan appeared through the fog, its headlights cutting two sharp lines of light across the trees. It slowed as it approached his house, tires crunching softly on the gravel. Marcus's heartbeat quickened. He took a step back toward the porch, watching as the car came to a stop by his gate. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a brown coat and holding a small notepad. He raised a hand in greeting, his smile too quick, too practiced. "Mr. Jenkins?" the man called out, his voice calm, almost friendly. "Morning, sir. Name's Harold Cobb. I'm a reporter with the Southern Gazette. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Marcus didn't move. He had heard enough smooth voices in his life to know when someone wasn't saying what they meant. "About what?" he asked, keeping his distance. "Well," the man said, taking a few steps forward, "we're doing a piece on the old Harlan disappearance. It's been 52 years this month, you know. Folks around here still talk about it. I heard you're something of a fixture on the lake. Thought maybe you could tell me if you've ever come across anything unusual out there." Marcus said nothing. The man's eyes darted to the shed just for a second before he continued. "People say the lake keeps secrets. I reckon you'd know more about that than anyone." "I don't know anything about that," Marcus said flatly. "Haven't found anything worth printing in your paper." Cobb smiled again, too easily. "Ah, but you did pull something out yesterday, didn't you? A metal box, maybe? Must have been quite the catch." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Who told you that?" "Oh, word travels fast in small towns," Cobb said with a shrug. "No harm in asking, right? I'm just looking for the truth." "The truth's not in my yard," Marcus said. Cobb studied him for a long moment, then gave a polite nod. All right, Mr. Jenkins, if you change your mind, here's my card. He placed a small rectangle of paper on the porch railing and turned to go. But before he got into his car, he looked back once more and said softly, "Sometimes the past has a way of finding its own way back to the surface. You take care out here." The car drove off slowly, disappearing into the trees. Marcus waited until the sound of the engine had faded before he picked up the card. The number was local. The name was printed cleanly in black letters, but something about it felt off. He tore the card in half and dropped it in the dirt. He went back inside, sat at the table, and stared out the window for a long time. The lake shimmered in the distance, peaceful as ever. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the man hadn't come alone, that someone else had been in the car, waiting, watching. By late afternoon, the weather began to change. The wind picked up, rustling through the reeds and shaking the loose shutters against the house. The first drops of rain splattered against the porch rail. Marcus stood at the window, uneasy, when another vehicle appeared on the road. This one was silver, newer, with tinted windows. It rolled to a stop exactly where the black sedan had been earlier. The door opened, and a different man stepped out, taller, sharper, wearing a dark suit that didn't belong in a place like Glenmore. He looked around the property slowly, his gaze lingering on the shed. Then he walked up to the porch with the smooth confidence of someone who never expected to be told no. "Good evening," he said, voice low but controlled. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Jenkins. My name's Daniel Harlan." The name hit Marcus like a sudden drop in temperature. Harlan, the same as the banker. The man smiled faintly, as if he'd noticed the reaction. "My grandfather used to own property around here," he continued. "I understand you've been fishing near where his boat went down. I came to ask if you found anything of his, papers, boxes, anything at all." Marcus stared at him. "No, haven't found a damn thing." Harlan tilted his head slightly, his smile not fading. "You're sure about that? Because someone said they saw you hauling something up yesterday. A safe, maybe?" Marcus's pulse began to quicken again. "People say a lot of things in this town. Doesn't make them true." "I understand," Harlan said smoothly. "But if you did happen to find something, anything that might belong to my family, I'd be willing to pay for its return. Generously. No questions asked." Marcus felt a flare of anger, but he hid it behind a blank expression. "I told you, I don't have anything of yours. You're wasting your time." Harlan's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, then shifted toward the shed. "May I?" he asked, already taking a step in that direction. "No," Marcus said sharply, "you may not." The silence between them was heavy, filled with the sound of rain starting to fall harder. Harlan studied him for another long second, then gave a polite nod. "Of course. My mistake. I didn't mean to intrude." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small card identical to the reporter's, and placed it on the porch railing. "If you change your mind, give me a call. I'd hate to see something valuable lost forever." He turned and walked back to his car. Before he got in, he looked toward the lake. "Beautiful place," he said quietly. "Hard to believe how much it's seen." Then he was gone. Marcus stood in the rain until the sound of the engine faded again. He looked down at the card, the name printed cleanly, the phone number underneath. The same precision as the last one, as though both men had come from the same printer, the same place, maybe even the same plan. He crumpled it in his fist and threw it into the water. By nightfall, the rain had become a storm. The wind howled against the house, bending the reeds flat against the shore. Lightning flashed over the lake, illuminating the surface for a heartbeat at a time. Marcus paced the kitchen, his mind racing. Two strangers in one day, both asking the same question. They hadn't just heard rumors, they knew. The question was, how? He pulled open the drawer under the counter and took out the heavy flashlight he used on the boat. The shed key glinted beside it. He hesitated, then grabbed both. The thunder masked the sound of his footsteps as he crossed the yard. When he reached the shed, rain soaked through his shirt, cold as ice. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled of damp wood and iron. The safe sat under the tarp, motionless. He tore the cover away, set the flashlight on the floor, and grabbed the crowbar he'd bought in town. The metal groaned when he wedged it into the seam of the door. The wind outside roared louder. He hit the crowbar with the heel of his boot, once, twice, again. The lock didn't break, but the frame shifted. He tried again, sweat mixing with rain, until finally the seam split just enough to see a flash of darkness inside. Then, through the noise of the storm, he heard something else. A car door slamming. He froze. The flashlight beam flickered as he turned it toward the window. Headlights swept across the yard. Someone was back. He killed the light and pressed himself against the wall, listening. Voices carried faintly through the rain. 2, maybe 3 men. One of them laughed quietly. The sound made his skin crawl. The footsteps came closer. He could see the shadows of the men moving past the window, dark shapes against the lightning. They were heading for the house. Marcus's breath came slow and quiet. He gripped the crowbar tighter, heart hammering. One of the voices spoke, clearer now. "He's got it. I told you. It's here." "Check the house first," another said. Then the shed. Marcus didn't wait. He slipped out the back door of the shed, moving around the far side toward the trees. The rain covered his steps, but the mud was deep. He almost slipped twice before reaching the shadows of the pines. From there, he looked back. The men had reached his porch. One of them kicked the door open. The sound cracked like gunfire through the storm. Lightning flashed again, and for an instant he saw their faces. Cold, intent, strangers. None of them were the reporter or the man in the suit, but he felt certain they were connected. They moved with purpose, not curiosity. The thunder rolled over the hills as Marcus ducked deeper into the trees, crouching low. He could hear them inside his house now, overturning chairs, opening cabinets, searching. His heart clenched when he heard one of them laugh again. A door slammed. Glass shattered. He waited, unmoving, until the storm began to drift east and the noise from the house quieted. The men came out again, cursing. One of them shouted something he couldn't make out over the rain, and then a sudden, harsh smell reached him. A smell he recognized instantly. Gasoline. They were going to burn it. Marcus's chest tightened as he watched one of them strike a lighter near the porch. The flame flared, and within seconds the dry boards caught. Fire spread fast, orange and hungry, lighting the rain like molten glass. The men stood for a moment, watching, then turned and ran toward their car. Tires spun in the mud, headlights cutting briefly through the smoke before disappearing into the dark. Marcus stayed hidden until the sound was gone, until all that was left was the crackle of fire and the steady hiss of rain on burning wood. His house was collapsing in on itself, the porch caving first, the roof following soon after. The flames threw long, unflickering shadows across the yard, across the shed, across the lake itself. He wanted to move, to run to the shed, to the safe, but he didn't. Not yet. He knew better than to step into the open too soon. Whoever those men were, they weren't finished. This was just the beginning. When the storm finally broke and the flames dimmed to embers, Marcus crept back toward the lake. The safe was still there, blackened by smoke but untouched. He knelt beside it, breathless, drenched, his reflection trembling on the slick metal surface. Everything he had owned was gone, turned to ash behind him. But the safe remained. He touched it once, lightly, the way someone might touch the surface of a grave. Then he whispered under his breath, barely audible even to himself, "Whatever you are, you've already cost me too much." The wind off the water carried the smell of smoke and rain across the valley. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled again, fading slowly into silence. Marcus stood and looked out at the lake, its dark expanse stretching endlessly beneath the night. The world had changed in less than an hour. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. And though the fire had died, the real danger, the kind that couldn't be seen or heard, was only just beginning to close in. When the morning came, it did not feel like morning at all. The air still smelled of smoke, and a gray film of ash clung to everything: the fence posts, the damp grass, even the stones near the lake. The storm had passed, but the world it left behind felt stripped and hollow. Where Marcus's house once stood, there was only a blackened skeleton of wood and a curl of steam rising into the pale light. He stood there, barefoot in the mud, staring at the ruin without expression, the skin on his face tight from the heat that had baked it through the night. His life, the one he had built in silence and solitude, was gone. He should have felt grief. Instead, he felt nothing but the dull weight of purpose pressing on his chest. The men had taken everything except the one thing they had come for: the safe. Somehow it had survived. The shed was scorched but intact, its old planks too damp to catch. He walked toward it slowly, the mud sucking at his heels with each step. Every movement of his body ached, his arms from the struggle, his throat raw from smoke, but he moved with a quiet certainty, as if he were being pulled by something larger than himself. He unlocked the shed and stepped inside. The smell of iron, burnt wood, and damp soil filled his lungs. The tarp had melted in patches, fused into the floorboards, revealing the dull curve of the safe beneath. He knelt and brushed away the debris, his fingers trembling not from fear, but exhaustion. The metal was streaked with soot, the paint blistered, but the structure was still solid. It looked like it could have lain at the bottom of the lake for another 100 years and still hold its secrets. For a long time he simply stared at it, listening to the faint ticking of rainwater dripping from the rafters. Then he stood and went to the workbench. Most of his tools were ruined, but the crowbar was still there, the handle blackened, the steel tip dull but unbroken. He gripped it tightly and returned to the safe. He no longer thought about money. He no longer thought about turning anything over to the police. All he wanted now was to know what he had lost everything for. If men were willing to burn his home to the ground for what was inside this box, then he needed to see it with his own eyes. He wedged the crowbar into the crack he had made the night before and pressed down hard. The metal groaned in protest. He shifted his weight, his muscles screaming, until finally he heard it. The faint, tearing sound of something giving way. A thin jet of dust and smoke slipped out from the seam, the scent old and dry like the breath of a tomb. He pulled again, and the lock snapped with a sharp metallic cry. The door fell open an inch, then another. He froze. For a moment, he half expected something to move inside, to reach out from the darkness, but there was nothing. only stillness. Slowly, he swung the door wide. The interior was lined with rotted fabric that disintegrated when he touched it. The air that came out was stale, damp, heavy with the scent of mold and time. Inside were several bundles wrapped in oilcloth, a small wooden box, and something else, a glint of gold among the gray. Marcus reached in and pulled the bundles out one by one, setting them on the work table. His hands shook. Each bundle was sealed with wax so old it cracked at the slightest touch. He broke one open. Inside were papers, dozens of them, some written in faded blue ink, others in pencil. The edges were warped and yellow, the words still legible. As he spread them out, he realized what they were. Letters, ledgers, signatures, bank documents. He recognized the name stamped on the top corner of one. First Southern Bank. Another bore a signature that made his pulse quicken. Walter J. Harlan. He sank into the chair and stared at the pages, trying to make sense of them. At first, it was just numbers and lines, withdrawals and deposits. But then the pattern began to appear. There were transfers between names he recognized from old newspaper headlines, local businessmen, officials, men whose families still held power in Glenmore. The numbers didn't add up. It was a cover-up, and it had gone on for years before Harlan's disappearance. He flipped through the stack until he found something different. It was a handwritten letter, dated 3 days before Harlan's supposed death. The ink had run in places, but the words were still clear enough to read. "If they come for me, they will find nothing. I have taken what they fear most and buried it where no one will think to look. The lake will keep it. And if the lake should one day give it back, let whoever finds it know that the truth lies not in the money, but in the names attached to it. I'm not the only one who stole. They all did, and they will kill to keep it hidden." Marcus read it twice, then a third time. His mouth was dry, his pulse pounding in his temples. The letter was signed simply, Walter Harlan. He set it aside and opened the next bundle. More papers, more letters. But there was something else, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a faded ribbon. He untied it carefully and peeled away the layers until a photograph fell out. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a small boy standing on a dock, smiling. He recognized the man immediately from old newspaper clippings. Walter Harlan, before everything had gone wrong. The woman must have been his wife, the boy, his son. Behind them, the lake stretched calm and silver under the sun. On the back, written in elegant handwriting, were the words, July 3rd, 1972. The last good day. Marcus turned the photo over again and stared at it. The people looked happy, ordinary, not like thieves or victims, just a family unaware that the water behind them would soon swallow everything they owned. He opened the wooden box next. Inside, cushioned in damp fabric, was a revolver. Old, but still oiled, the metal unblemished by time. The serial number had been scratched away. He lifted it carefully, his hand trembling. The weight of it was heavy, familiar. He had seen guns like this before. Military issue, not something an ordinary banker would keep. Beneath it lay a single envelope sealed with wax. He broke the seal. The letter inside was short. "For whoever finds this, know that I did not drown. They made sure of that. My blood is on their hands, but their names are on these papers. Do with them what you will, but beware. Truth draws blood as easily as lies." The signature at the bottom was different this time. Not Walter's handwriting, but that of a woman. Clara Harlan. Marcus leaned back, his heart racing. The room seemed to close in around him. He suddenly understood that the story the town had told for 50 years was not the truth at all. The banker hadn't stolen from anyone. He had tried to expose something far worse: corruption, conspiracy, murder. The people who had silenced him had not disappeared into history. Their children now sat on town councils, ran businesses, wore badges, and somehow they had known when the lake gave up its secret. He pressed his palms against his face. Everything he had lost, the fire, the fear, the sleepless nights, it all traced back to these papers. Proof of sins that had been buried under decades of silence. He spread the documents out again, scanning them until one name leapt out at him, a name he recognized from the present. Sheriff Tom Harlan, the grandson, the man who had smiled at him at the grocery store, who had once offered to buy fish from him when times were hard. A man whose family had spent half a century ensuring that no one ever dredged too deep in Glenmore Lake. Marcus's blood ran cold. He finally understood why those men had come in the night, why they hadn't bothered with threats before setting his house on fire. They weren't afraid of money. They were afraid of exposure. He looked toward the window. The light had dimmed again, the sky turned the color of wet steel. The lake was still visible through the trees, perfectly still. Somewhere under that calm surface lay everything that had started this, and now the truth sat in his hands. He thought of taking the papers to the next town, to the police there, or to a journalist in the city. But what if they were in on it too? What if the network stretched farther than Glenmore? He had no proof that anyone would believe him. All he had were stories, old letters, and the burned remains of his life. He looked down at the revolver again. The cylinder still turned smoothly. Whoever had hidden it had made sure it would work when needed. He placed it back in the box and closed the lid. The air inside the shed felt heavy, oppressive, as though the very walls were listening. The silence stretched on until the sun began to dip. Outside, the water rippled faintly as a breeze crossed the surface. Marcus packed the letters and papers into a burlap sack and tied it tight. He hid it under the floorboards of the shed, placing a loose plank over it. The revolver he kept. He didn't know what he would do with it yet, but something in him knew he might need it soon. He stepped outside, breathing in the cold air. The ash smell still lingered, but the wind had begun to carry it away. Across the lake, a single bird glided low over the water before disappearing into the reeds. The world looked calm again, deceptively calm, as if the violence of the night before had never happened. But Marcus knew better now. He understood the lake's silence, the town's silence, the kind that held generations of fear beneath its surface. He had touched the truth, and it had burned him. When night finally came, he sat by the shore, the revolver resting on his knee, and watched the moon rise over Glenmore Lake. The water glowed faintly, a mirror of pale light. He thought of Walter and Clara Harlan, of the child in the photograph, of how the world had buried their story under lies and greed. He thought of his own house burning, of the faces of the men in the rain, and of the way the lake had refused to let their secret stay hidden. Somewhere behind him, deep in the woods, a twig snapped. He turned, but saw nothing. Only shadows moving between trees. He smiled bitterly to himself and whispered, "Come and take it." The wind rose again, carrying his words out over the lake, where they vanished into the fog. Inside the shed, beneath the floorboards, the papers waited, dry and silent, holding the truth that had already begun to change everything. The dawn, after the fire, came cold and sharp, the kind of morning that made breath hang in the air like smoke. Marcus woke on the damp ground beside the shed, wrapped in an old blanket that smelled of ash. The night had been restless, full of creaking trees, distant footsteps that might have been imagination, and the low whisper of the lake moving against the shore. He sat up slowly, his muscles stiff from exhaustion. The air was still heavy with the scent of burned wood and wet earth. His home was gone. The life he had built, every memory, every comfort, turned to dust in a single night. Only the safe had survived, and inside it, a truth that was heavier than any metal. He looked toward the water. The surface was calm now, deceptively calm, as if mocking him. Somewhere beneath that mirrored skin lay the beginning of this story. One man's desperate attempt to bury corruption and another's misfortune in dragging it back to light. Marcus rubbed his hands together to shake off the cold. He could have left right then, walked away, pretended it never happened. But he knew it was too late. The moment he had opened that safe, his name had been written into someone else's ledger of sins. He went into the shed, where the faint smell of oil and smoke lingered. The papers were still hidden beneath the floorboard. He pried it open and checked them again, damp at the corners but intact. The revolver lay beside the sack, gleaming faintly in the dim light. He picked it up, feeling its weight. The weapon seemed to hum in his hand, a thing that had waited too long to be used. He thought about leaving it behind, but the memory of those men by the fire, their calm voices, their laughter as his house burned, stopped him. He slipped the gun into his jacket pocket and replaced the boards. By the time the sun was fully up, he had made up his mind. He couldn't stay here. Whoever had sent those men would come back to finish what they'd started. He needed to leave Glenmore at least long enough to figure out what to do next. Maybe he could reach the next town, find a journalist or a lawyer who didn't owe favors to the Harlan family. He would show them the papers, the letters, the truth. He loaded what little he had into his old pickup truck, a few tools, a blanket, a can of fuel. Before he left, he walked to the lake's edge. The reflection of the sky wavered beneath him, pale and smooth. "You've taken enough from me," he murmured. "Now it's my turn." Then he turned back toward the road. He didn't see the car until it was too late. It appeared from behind the curve in the trees, black and slow-moving, blocking the only way out. Marcus's heart jumped. For a second, he thought it might be a police cruiser, but when he saw the two men inside, one in a leather jacket, the other smoking, he knew they weren't law. He threw the truck into reverse, gravel spitting from the tires. The men noticed him instantly. The car lunged forward, the engine roaring. Marcus turned sharply, steering toward the lake. The road was narrow, slick with mud from the storm. The truck fish-tailed, the rear wheels sliding dangerously close to the edge of the embankment. Behind him, the black car followed, closing fast. He could see their headlights flickering through the trees, the glint of sunlight off a gun barrel from the passenger window. He pressed the gas harder, heart pounding. He didn't have a plan, only instinct. The dirt track curved down toward the boathouse, where his small fishing boat still sat tethered to the dock. He slammed on the brakes, jumped out before the truck had stopped rolling, and ran for the water. The men shouted behind him, their voices breaking through the stillness like glass. He heard one of them fire. The bullet tore through the air and punched into the truck door. Another shot followed, splintering the dock post beside him. He ducked low, sprinted the last few yards, and untied the rope. The old boat rocked violently as he pushed it into the water and climbed aboard. The motor coughed twice before it caught. He shoved the throttle forward, the engine growling to life. Behind him, the men reached the dock, shouting. One of them fired again. The bullet whined off the metal hull, missing his leg by inches. He didn't look back. The boat lurched forward, cutting through the water. The lake stretched wide before him, a sheet of silver broken only by small ripples. The sound of the engine echoed across the still air. He headed toward the far shore, where the pines grew thick and the old trails led deeper into the woods. Behind him, the men had found another boat, smaller but faster, and the chase began. Marcus pushed the engine harder, the wind stinging his eyes. Spray hit his face, cold and sharp. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The second boat was gaining, its bow slicing through the water like a knife. One of the men stood near the front, raising his gun. Marcus ducked just as another bullet whizzed past, shattering the windshield. The shards glittered for an instant before falling into the lake. He veered toward the northern inlet, where the water narrowed into a twisting channel lined with cypress roots. The motor strained, protesting the shallow depth. Branches whipped his shoulders as he passed, the air filling with the hiss of insects and the smell of wet decay. The men followed, their engine howling behind him. He could feel the boat dragging now, the propeller striking mud. He killed the motor and grabbed an oar, pushing silently between the shadows of the trees. The water here was darker, thicker, filled with fallen limbs that lay just beneath the surface. Every sound seemed magnified, the creak of wood, the murmur of wind, the distant hum of their boat approaching. Marcus drifted behind a cluster of reeds, crouching low. The other boat slowed as it entered the channel. He could hear them talking, their voices tense. "He can't have gone far," one said. "Keep the light steady." A bright beam swept across the water, slicing through the fog. Marcus held his breath as it passed inches from his face, lighting the sweat on his skin. Then it moved on. He waited until the sound of their engine echoed farther down the inlet before he slipped quietly out from his hiding place, paddling in the opposite direction. He made it back to open water, gasping from the effort. The far shore loomed ahead, a stretch of dark forest untouched by roads. He aimed for it, every muscle screaming. Behind him a shout rang out. They'd spotted him again. The motor roared and the chase resumed. He didn't think. He reacted. The shoreline was only a few hundred yards away. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the revolver. The metal felt warm in his hand, almost alive. He turned, steadied his aim on the approaching boat, and fired. The first shot missed, but the second hit something. A spark flew from their engine. The motor sputtered, then caught again, louder, angrier. They were still coming. He fired once more. This time the bullet struck the driver's side. The man flinched, the boat swerved, and Marcus used the moment to steer toward the reeds. The bow struck mud with a jolt that nearly threw him forward. He leaped out into waist-deep water, the cold stealing his breath, and stumbled toward the shore. Behind him, the men's boat rammed into the reeds. One of them cursed. Another shot cracked through the air. Marcus dropped flat in the mud. The bullet tore into a tree above him. He crawled forward, dragging himself onto the bank, and ran into the forest. The trees closed around him, tall and wet, their roots twisting like veins. His breath came in harsh bursts, every step a battle against exhaustion. He could hear them following, branches breaking, voices shouting, the sound of someone crashing through the underbrush. He pushed deeper, using the terrain he knew from childhood, where the ground rose into a ridge that overlooked the lake. At the top, he stopped to catch his breath. The woods were silent again. He crouched behind a fallen log and waited. The fog had reached even here, coiling between the trunks like pale smoke. Somewhere below, the men were searching, their flashlights cutting erratic paths through the trees. One of them shouted his name. "Jenkins, we know you've got it. Give it up and maybe you live. Marcus stayed still. He could feel the papers pressed against his ribs under his shirt, the corner of one digging into his skin. He remembered the line from Clara Harlan's letter, "Truth draws blood as easily as lies." He smiled bitterly. They didn't want the truth, only its silence. He waited until the voices drifted farther away, then slipped down the other side of the ridge. The ground sloped steeply toward another inlet, smaller and rockier. The lake shimmered below, silver in the pale dawn. He knew this part of the shore well. There was an old boathouse half buried in vines where his grandfather once stored nets. If he could reach it, he might find shelter. The sound of footsteps behind him grew louder again. They were closing in. He ran the last stretch, branches clawing at his arms. The boathouse appeared through the mist, tilted, sagging, half submerged. He ducked inside. The air smelled of mildew and rot. Broken planks floated in the shallow water. He crouched behind the remnants of a wooden beam, breathing hard. The revolver was slick with sweat in his hand. Outside, the footsteps slowed. One of the men was close. He could hear him wading through the shallows. The beam of a flashlight swept through the cracks in the wall. Marcus raised the gun, fingered tight on the trigger. The light paused, then turned away. The sound of footsteps moved on. He waited until the silence stretched, then finally exhaled. His whole body trembled. He set the revolver down for a moment, wiping mud from his face. He didn't know how long he stayed there. The storm clouds above began to break, letting thin rays of sunlight filter through the trees. The world was quiet again except for the soft lapping of the water against the shore. Marcus stood and looked out through the gap in the wall. The lake lay still, smooth as glass. His boat was gone, the men's boat half sunk in the reeds. He felt a surge of grim satisfaction. They hadn't caught him. Not yet. But he knew this wasn't over. People like that didn't stop until they got what they wanted. He thought of the papers hidden in his jacket, the evidence that could destroy the legacy of every man whose name was written there. He didn't know where he would go or who he could trust, but he knew one thing: he would not let them win. He stepped out of the boathouse, the revolver in his hand, the wind from the lake brushing against his face. Behind him, smoke from his burned home still lingered faintly on the horizon. Ahead of him, the forest stretched endless and dark. The water shimmered like a mirror, holding the reflection of a man who had lost everything but his will. As he walked into the trees, a faint sound carried across the lake, a car door slamming, an engine starting. They would come again. But now he was ready. The lake had taken enough from him. It was time it gave something back. He disappeared into the woods, leaving behind the empty shore and the rippling water that swallowed every trace of his passing. The chase was not over, but for the first time, Marcus felt the balance begin to shift. The lake had chosen him once by chance, but now it seemed to breathe with him. Its silence no longer a threat, but a promise. In that stillness, he felt something awaken, a resolve deeper than fear. And as the morning wind rose, carrying the smell of smoke and wet earth, he knew this fight would not end quietly. The woods felt endless that morning, a maze of gray trunks and damp shadows stretching in every direction. Marcus moved slowly through them, his body aching from the night before, every muscle tight with exhaustion and cold. His boots squelched in the mud, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and rot. The chase had burned through the last of his fear. What remained in him now was something quieter, heavier, a grim understanding that survival alone was not enough. The lake had dragged him into a story that began long before his time, and he could not walk away from it anymore. He reached a small clearing and stopped to rest. The sunlight broke through the clouds in narrow shafts, touching the leaves with gold. Birds had begun to return after the storm, their cries faint and uncertain, as if they too were testing whether the world was safe again. Marcus sat on a fallen log and looked down at his hands. They were cut and blistered, the skin torn where the rope had rubbed. His jacket was soaked through, the revolver inside its pocket a cold weight against his ribs. The papers he had taken from the safe were still dry, wrapped tightly in the oilcloth beneath his shirt. He could feel their stiffness against his chest with every breath. The truth was literally pressed against his heart, and it felt like both a burden and a curse. For a moment, he thought of burying them, hiding them deep in the woods where no one would ever find them. But even as the thought came, he knew he couldn't do it. Too much had been lost already. His home, his peace, maybe even his future. To bury the truth now would make all that loss meaningless. He rose again and began walking downhill toward the southern edge of the forest, where he knew an old road ran parallel to the river. From there, he could follow it to the next town, maybe hitch a ride or find someone willing to listen. The road was his only chance of turning the secret he carried into something that mattered. But every step toward it felt like wading deeper into danger. When the trees began to thin, he crouched low and peered through the underbrush. The dirt road was just visible, running like a pale scar through the forest. Across it lay open fields, and farther still, the faint outline of the water tower that marked the edge of town. But between him and that horizon, a single car sat idling, its black hood glinting under the weak sunlight. The same car that had chased him earlier. Marcus froze. He could see two men inside, silhouettes through the tinted glass. They weren't moving, just waiting. His first thought was that they had given up the search, but then he noticed the open trunk, the glint of something metallic inside. A shovel. Maybe two. He backed slowly into the shadows, heart pounding. They knew he'd come this way. They were waiting for him to try and cross. He turned, moving back into the forest, his mind racing. He couldn't go forward. Not yet. He would have to circle around the lake, approach from the north side where the road forked toward the highway. It would take hours, maybe all day, but it was his only chance. He started walking again, keeping low, every step careful on the wet ground. By midday, the sun had climbed higher, burning off most of the mist. The woods had changed with the light. They no longer felt like protection, but like a trap. Every rustle of leaves made him think of footsteps, every snapping twig a warning. He stopped often, listening, trying to separate real sounds from his imagination. But when he heard a faint mechanical hum far behind him, the low growl of an engine moving slowly through the trees, he knew he wasn't imagining it this time. They were tracking him. Marcus quickened his pace, cutting through thickets and over roots, his breath coming hard. He could hear voices now, faint but distinct. One of them laughed. The sound made his blood run cold. He had thought the forest would give him an advantage, but these men were patient. They had done this before. He came to a ravine, narrow but deep, where rainwater still flowed at the bottom in a slow, muddy stream. A fallen tree bridged it halfway. He tested the trunk with his foot, then crawled across, moving fast. Behind him, the sound of the engine grew louder. He reached the other side, slid down the bank, and splashed through the shallow water, heading downstream. The mud sucked at his boots, but he pushed on, ducking under the low branches of an oak. Minutes felt like hours. When he finally stopped to listen, the forest was silent again. Either he had lost them or they had stopped moving to listen too. He crouched behind a rock, forcing himself to breathe quietly. The silence stretched. Then a twig snapped nearby. Too close. He turned sharply, hand on the revolver. A figure stepped out from behind a tree, and for a moment, Marcus's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't one of the men. It was a stranger, a young man, no more than 20, wearing a park ranger's uniform. The kid froze when he saw the gun, eyes wide. "Easy," the ranger said, raising both hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." Marcus lowered the weapon slightly, but didn't put it away. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "There are men in the woods, armed." "I know," the ranger said quickly. "We got a call this morning. Said there was smoke by the lake. Sheriff sent me to check it out." "You live out there?" Marcus hesitated. The word sheriff tasted like poison now. "Not anymore," he said quietly. "They burned my place down." The ranger frowned, taking a cautious step closer. "Who did?" Marcus shook his head. "People who don't want certain things found." The kid's brow furrowed. "You should come with me. I've got a radio back at my truck. We can call for help." "Help from who?" Marcus snapped. "The same sheriff whose name is in those papers? The same one whose family started all this?" The ranger blinked, confusion crossing his face. "What are you talking about?" Marcus realized he was talking too fast, too loud. He took a step back, glancing through the trees. The sound of the engine had returned, closer now. He could almost see the glimmer of headlights through the trunks. "Get out of here," Marcus said. "You don't understand what's coming." "I can't just leave you out here," the ranger said, lowering his voice. "If someone's after you—" Marcus didn't let him finish. He grabbed the kid by the shoulder and shoved him toward the ravine. "Go," he hissed. "Now." The ranger stumbled, looked back once, then ran. A second later, the sharp crack of a gunshot echoed through the woods. Bark splintered near Marcus's head. He dropped to the ground as another shot followed. The men had found him. He crawled behind a tree, pulled out the revolver, and fired blindly toward the sound. The forest exploded with noise, shouts, more gunfire, the whine of bullets tearing through leaves. One of the men yelled something Marcus couldn't make out. He fired again, then rolled down the slope toward the stream. The water hit his face like ice. He could hear them moving above, their footsteps quick and sure. He pushed himself up and ran, following the stream as it curved back toward the lake. His lungs burned. His legs felt like lead. But adrenaline kept him moving. Every few seconds he looked back. The forest seemed to shift and close behind him, swallowing the men's shadows. At last the trees broke open, the lake stretched before him vast and gleaming under the afternoon sun. He stumbled onto the muddy shore, gasping for breath. For the first time, he could see how far the fire had spread the night before. The far bank was blackened, the air still faintly smoky. His old dock was gone, nothing but charred stumps poking from the water. He turned back. The forest edge was quiet now. The men had stopped following, for the moment. Maybe they were waiting for him to make his next move. He looked down at the water. His reflection stared back, gaunt and hollow-eyed. Behind that reflection, faint and distorted, the lake shimmered with its own kind of life. He could almost imagine faces moving beneath the surface, ghosts of those who had come before him, men like Walter and Clara Harlan who had trusted the wrong people, spoken the wrong truths. He knew he couldn't stay here. He had to finish what he'd started. He pulled the bundle of papers from his shirt and held it in both hands. The wind tugged at the edges, rustling them like whispers. For a moment, he thought of throwing them into the water, letting the lake take them back. But then he remembered Clara's words. Do with them what you will, but beware. Truth draws blood as easily as lies. He tightened his grip. A faint sound broke the silence, a car door slamming somewhere behind him. Marcus turned. The black sedan was parked at the tree line. Two men stepped out, moving slowly, guns drawn. One of them called out, "You can't run forever, Jenkins. Hand it over and we'll let you walk away." Marcus laughed, a low, bitter sound. "You burned my life to the ground," he said softly, almost to himself. "What's left to walk away to?" He slipped the papers into his jacket, raised the revolver, and backed toward the water. The men fanned out, cautious. "Don't be stupid," one said. "You think anybody's gonna believe you? You're nobody, a fisherman with a story. Those papers don't mean a damn thing without the right people to read them." Marcus kept moving until the lake reached his knees. The cold bit into him, but he didn't stop. "Maybe," he said, "but someone will find them, and when they do, they'll know what you did." He aimed and fired. The shot echoed across the lake. One of the men dropped instantly. The other returned fire, bullets tearing through the water. Marcus fired again, once, twice, until the revolver clicked empty. Then he turned and dove beneath the surface. The lake closed over him like a curtain of glass. The world above vanished. The cold was absolute, biting into his lungs as he swam deeper. Light filtered down in silver ribbons. For a moment, he thought he saw something. Shapes moving in the distance like figures suspended in the water, faces watching. He felt a strange calm then, a sense of belonging, as though the lake itself had opened its arms. He broke the surface on the far side minutes later, gasping for air. Behind him, the men were gone. Only the echo of gunfire remained. He pulled himself onto the muddy shore, coughing, drenched and shivering. The papers were still inside his jacket, miraculously dry. He lay there for a long time, staring up at the pale sky, the smell of smoke and rain filling his lungs. When he finally stood, the forest on this side was quiet, untouched by fire or footsteps. The wind stirred the reeds gently. He turned once to look back at the lake. From here, the water looked peaceful again, the surface unbroken, betraying nothing of what had happened. It would keep its silence, just as it always had. He began walking north, toward the distant road. The papers weighed against his chest like a heartbeat, steady and alive. Somewhere out there was someone who would listen, someone not bound by the town's fear or the Harlan name. He would find them, or he would die trying. As he reached the ridge, he stopped and looked back one last time. The sun had broken through the clouds, turning the lake to gold. The reflection of the smoke from his ruined home still lingered faintly on the horizon. He thought of his grandfather's voice, old and grave. "The lake never forgets, boy. It just waits." Marcus nodded to the water, a silent farewell. Then he turned and walked toward the world beyond the trees, carrying with him the truth the lake had tried to bury. Behind him, Glenmore Lake shimmered under the sun, calm and eternal, its surface closing over the last ripples of a man who had dared to wake its ghosts. In that silence lay the price of truth and the cost of keeping it. If you've made it this far, don't stop now. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. New mysteries, hidden stories, and shocking true endings you won't believe. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who loves a good secret, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The next story drops soon. Don't blink or you'll miss it.